Ministries, Church of God, Godcast podcast. Yep. This is our very first what we're calling a Godcast, which is similar to a podcast, but we are focused on God. So we're going to call it a Godcast. And we should be coming out with these multiple times throughout the week. We're also happy to announce that we're going to start doing Bible studies on Wednesday nights. I'll post a time on our Facebook page later that you can enjoy us. And I'm also excited to bring you that we are streaming both live to Facebook and also to YouTube. Thank you. The words forgot me there. So you can watch us either on Facebook or YouTube. YouTube's nice because it's a lot easier to bring up on your TV screen, so you can watch us on your TV screen as well. And we also fixed some video itches, and we're able to broadcast in high definition. Although we're still working we're still wondering what the color is going to look like when it comes out. So you'll be first to know before us. Um, so I'd like to welcome you tonight. Our Godcasts are just going to be random subjects, although came across a topic that I think is going to be really fun to go over, and it's going to be going over the parables of Jesus. And I think we probably have like 30 or 40 some different parables that we'll address. We might be able to get through more than one a day, we'll see. But these will come up just randomly between the weeks, so we don't have any set schedule for it. Just when we feel the inspiration of God telling us to get down here and give you the word. So our first parable from Jesus is the parable of salt of the earth. And we can find this, I think it's in a couple verses. I forgot to look that up for you, or in a couple books of the gospel. But we're going to look at it from Matthew 5:13. And it says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." Now, this could be a puzzling parable unless we really dig into it and really do some studying on it. And even then, we come up with what's not typical, but we come up with multiple possibilities of the meaning behind it. And we're going to look at the most plausible um, meaning of this text as we go over the presentation tonight. And I'll also list some of the other ones as well. Typically, we want one definition for what Jesus is trying to tell us. But like I said, this is a puzzling one. But once we go through here, I feel like you'll have a very good, sound understanding of what he's trying to tell us. When he begins this passage, he's saying, "You are the salt of the earth." And we can understand this in a couple of different ways. First of all, if we look at the properties of salt, salt preserves food. The disciples and apostles all are to share the gospel of Christ, and to do so preserves our soul. It prevents us from decaying. The flesh is not, and if the flesh is not preserved, it will rot and be good for nothing. It'll be eaten by maggots as it spoils. So you see, salt has a very important quality in both preserving food and preserving our soul. If our soul's not preserved, our body's not preserved, we're going to be we're going to rot. So that's one meaning that he uses when he's talking about how salt will preserve us. The second way we can look at it is we can also have a meaning in salt as a savory spice or a flavor that can be seen in the gospel being, and we can look at that as the gospel being savory. And what that means is when the gospel reaches our tongue, it's a flavorful, savory flavor that we receive in our souls. It's something that we desire, and it tastes good to us. We desire that salt and that savory, and that's what they're talking about when when the salt is like the gospel, where it brings us a savory flavor that is enjoyable to our taste. And we can also look at this as salt purifies our soul. If we did not have this salt, just as our meat would become corrupt, so will man and things of this earth, and man's delight and our sinful nature. So salt is preserving our soul, but our earthly flesh is wants to sin. That's its nature. It's a sinful nature, and through this sin, it wants to purify. It wants to glorify its desires, glorify its sinfulness, and glorify all that is bad. And that's what we're talking about. Where sin, the flesh is the sin, but our soul is godly. And with this salt, the salt purifies our souls, which can in turn refresh us inside and preserve us eternally. Now, if we further examine the text, Jesus tells us, "But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again?" And this is a very interesting passage. We normally don't recognize salt as losing its saltiness, or at least I never have. But it can actually happen, and this can be seen in a place called Valley of Salt, which is located near Gebel in Syria, and it's a little bit over 300 miles away from Israel. And in this outer portion of these salt mines that are coming out from the land, the outer parts of them are exposed to the weather, exposed to the sea, exposed to the rain, and that actually removes the saltiness from the outer layers of the salt vein. And those outer layers we can look at as our flesh, our fleshly body, losing its saltiness. But if we break that salt in pieces, the inner parts of it are still fresh and savory. We can view that as our soul being salty and flavory. We are also told that the Holy Spirit brings us this 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 character as it's part of its character. Um, so, and next part, if we look at it, the verse goes on to tell us what will happen if the saltiness is lost. It is no longer good for anything. Can you imagine using salt on your food if it has no flavor? It would have no purpose. What would you do with this salt? Um, it's no longer good for anything. We would throw it out. And this is what this verse is saying. If it loses its saltiness, it's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out. And it goes on to say, how can it be made salty again? Can you put the flavor of salt back in salt? And this is a retaliatory statement. He's asking the question, can you do that? No, you can't. Although with Christ, everything is possible. Everything, every sin can be forgiven except for rejecting Christ himself. That's the only sin that can't be forgiven because then you're not relying upon Christ. You're not calling upon him. You're denying him. Um, so if we further look into this, um, doesn't that scare you? We look into the meaning of these verses, and that should scare us. If we are not salty with the Spirit, we are to be thrown out. We are useless, no good for anything. The last part of this verse, when we look into it, it states the only thing. Oh, it does give us a factor that what this salt is good for. The only thing this flavorless salt is good for is to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, this verse should really scare you. This is telling you what happens if you are flavorless, if you do not have the gospel in you. This is telling us that you're going to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. And that's in reference to hell, in reference to eternity, which lasts forever. It's never ending. So if we are flavorless, we are thrown out and trampled upon in hell, never to have a relationship with God again, never to see the glory of heaven, to be in all torment for eternity. And that's a long time. Now, we can apply this to our lives by the way we live today. We can see the importance of this saltiness and the flavor, especially to those around us. When we're seen in public, the public view our character, and our character should be flavorful. It should be salty. How about that? But the spirit should shine within us, and this should be evident to the public. Our our good taste need to be exposed in the public as we go about our daily deeds. People view our actions and they make an impression upon based upon our actions. How can we tell them about Christ if they look at us with contempt with the way that we live? We need to be good in the eyes of the public. We need to represent Christ. We need to live our daily lives just as Christ would. And it needs not to be an act, but just part of the way we live daily. It needs to be part of our lifestyle. And this should be a good thing. This should be part of joy, the joy that Christ brings us, which, by the way, we'll be going over tomorrow during, what are we going over tomorrow? Oh, the third candle. Yes, we'll be going over um, Advent. I'm sorry. My mind's focused on this parable and I'm forgetting the simple words, but yes, we'll be going over the third week of Advent. And the candle is joy. It's actually called the candle of the shepherd, and its distinction is joy. And we will look over that, we'll examine it, we'll see why is shepherd in reference to joy, and what joy is this scripture actually talking about. And I thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you will be with us tomorrow. And hopefully, we'll be doing a Bible study coming up as well. And we'll give you further information about that, along with what topics we'll be covering. So you can look it up ahead of time and be prepared. And you can throw your comments out there on the chat channels as well, so we can view them. And if you have questions, try to answer them back. If you have special prayer requests, throw them out there, and we'll throw you into a prayer, so we may glorify God in our prayers by asking them for His help. And I thank you very much for joining us tonight.